Yo, yo. Whew. What's going on, y'all? Hey, Mr. Josh, how you doing?
Doing well. How we doing?
I am cool. I'm cool. Mr. Josh, did you get my email?
I did. We are on a new packet. It is very
We
exciting.
are. And since they condensed the school year, we're going to have to speed through this a little bit more than we normally do. All right, so Crisis and Compromise, Antebellum America. Antebellum America, pre-Civil War is what antebellum means. So when you see Antebellum America, they're referring to pre-Civil War America, okay? So we'll look at this first section. And Mr. Josh, actually, do you mind pulling this up on your screen, Mr. Josh?
Sure.
Mr. Josh, I'm going to ask you to read through this first section.
Got you.
I got a slight little issue. I will be back. Have a little issue here. But yeah, if you can read through that first section, and I'll be here. It should be, I think, 5 paragraphs here. Guys,
Yeah.
we're on page 4, the need for social reform. The need for social reform. And Mr. Josh, if you can read, let's say, the need for social reform into page 5, we'll stop where it says challenging slavery, because I want to discuss that piece.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks a lot. Hold on, guys. I have a little issue I got to take care of.
So we are going to start out source A. We're going to go first paragraph, and I'll just stop for some important points, but we're just going to go through it. So the industrialization that took place in the early 1800s brought big changes to the United States. The urban population of the nation increased as young men and women from the countryside moved to the cities to work in factories. There, immigrants primarily from Northern and Western Europe, looking for better jobs and a better life in America, joined them. So what we do is when we talk about industrialization, what we're saying is instead of people farming, people are working in factories, they're working in the cities, they're living in tall buildings, and people are living closer together. During this time, all around the world, countries were doing the same thing. People were moving off farms and moving to the cities for work. So we're seeing that around the world, and we're also seeing that in the United States. In 1800, the population of New York City, the largest urban center in the US at the time, was just over 60,000. By 1830, 30 years later, that number had jumped to more than 300,000. New York was not the only place that was expanding. From 1800 to 1840, over 40 years, the total population of the country increased from 2 million to 17 million people. Urban growth led to overcrowded, dangerous, and unsanitary living conditions for the working class. Factory work required long days in unhealthy and dangerous conditions. As a result, several earlier labor movements called for improving such working conditions. One movement called for limiting the workday, and in some cases, workers might spend up to 12 hours on the job. So this is important because hopefully, as all of you know, in the United States right now, we work 8-hour workdays. So we have an 8-hour shift. Hopefully we get 8 hours of sleep, and then the rest of the day is up to us. Back in the 1800s, before they had laws that guaranteed that, people could work 12-hour days, 14-hour days in very bad conditions. They got hurt. Some of them even died on the job, and they were not paid much money. So these people who were being taken advantage of because they were working so much and weren't getting paid enough were starting to fight back and starting to demand some money and some safety when they worked. In 1835, workers went on strike in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to demand a 10-hour workday. In 1847, New Hampshire enacted the first state law for a maximum of a 10-hour workday. Men and women workers alike also started to demand higher wages, and as a result, many labor unions started to emerge. So when we talk about a labor union, all a union is a group of workers or a group of people that get together and make decisions as a group. So if I look at a class and I ask you all to decide what grade you want on your test, you would all give me individual answers, and most likely none of you would agree on the same number. So because you all give different answers, it means that it has less power. It has less impact on the decision. But if you all got together and approached us as one big group and said, hey, we would like this grade, you have more power because you're working together, because you're working as a group. So workers decided that if they worked as a group, they could get more protections, they could get paid more, and that they would get better results out of trying to fight back against being used as workers.
Correct, Mr. Josh. And the term they would use for that would be unionization?
Yes.
Unionization. So give you guys one more example. As teachers, we all belong to a teachers union within the district. So when it comes to our salary, our benefits, our health care, our union negotiates with the district to negotiate what we get paid and all that stuff. So once again, strength in numbers. And this is when we first start seeing this unionized idea come along. A lot of jobs nowadays do have unions. There are groups that don't believe in unions and try to break them up, but it's something important to remember as you guys move forward.
So keep going in paragraph 3. In Lynn, Massachusetts, for example, female shoebinders formed an alliance in 1833 and demanded higher pay. Drawing on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, these women proclaimed that women as well as men have certain inalienable rights, among which is the right at all times of peaceably assembling to consult upon the common good. As industrialization progressed during the middle of the 1800s, working conditions somewhat improved, and in some instances, wages increased. However, there were still many new challenges due to technological innovations and continually changing patterns of migration and urban growth.
All right, I got a couple questions. First question for the group. What is an inalienable right? We talked about this way back in Unit 2. We talked about the Constitution. If I tell you you have an inalienable right, what type of right is that? An inalienable right. What does it mean to have an inalienable right? Take an educated guess if you don't remember. Inalienable right. What does that mean? What does it mean to have an inalienable right? Excellent. Right. A right that can't be taken away. Right. A right that can't be taken away. Now, my second question, when they say technological innovation, what could they mean by technological innovation that might have made it a challenge or made it difficult for these women in their working conditions? What do they mean by technological innovation? What could have been an innovation We talked about them having labor unions. We talked about them working in a shoe factory. What type of innovations might have taken place that might have affected their ability to work, unionize, continue in that job? What do you think? Said they were shoe binding. What do you guys think might have happened? Technological innovation. What do you think might have come into play? What could have been built? Okay, robots. What am I looking for? It starts more with an F. It does have to do with robots. Shoe binding. Shoe binding. Where does shoe binding take place today? I'm looking for an F word. Come on, drop it in the chat. Come on. All right, I'll give it to him. A factory. So guys, remember, factories came along and they did jobs in factories that used to be done by people. So back then, shoe binding used to be done by hand by individuals. And then they built factories that could do it. Just like, good, I see somebody dropped it in there. There was a lag. And just like today with cars, right? Like there used to be a lot more workers who literally put cars together and they assembled every piece. Now you have machines that do it. So there are very few jobs in that industry compared to how many jobs there used to be. So that's something important to note.
Yep. And it is also important to remember that with work in the factory, you had ways of life or things that people were doing. So if I'm making shoes, if I'm making chairs, or if I'm doing something else, before I worked in the factory, before I moved to the city, I used to do that at home. I would make it by myself or with a few people, and I would make the whole object. So I could say that that shoe was mine, that chair was mine. It was something I could take pride in. But when you move to the factory, you use technology, you use machines to make it easier to build these things. So you can build a lot more of them because it's easier and quicker. But the switch, the problem with that is that instead of me working on the whole thing, the whole shoe or the whole chair or the whatever, I'm working on a very small part of it, which means that I'm very good at one or two things, which means I sit in the same place all day. I don't move. It's very boring. And with a lot of these jobs, it was very dangerous. The factory equipment, the machines were not very safe. People were getting hurt all the time. People were even dying at work because there was no rules to prevent bad things from happening. So these people who are making a lot of stuff are not getting paid a lot, and they're in a very dangerous situation. So at that point, they start to come together and they say, hey, we need to fight back because we're better than this. So you see the move towards the cities as a move towards people starting to work together more than they had to start accomplishing things. So talked about factories, and there was another important thing when we talk about moving to the cities as well. So we're going to go to the next two paragraphs. Actually, yeah, someone dropped in the chat they had kids working in the factories too. That's exactly correct. They had no laws against kids working in factories until like 1915, 1920. So for a very, very, very long time, people your age, people younger than y'all, were working in dangerous factories to try to give money for their families. They didn't go to school, were just working and getting paid because they were paid less than older women and old men.
And something unique as well is that certain machines, when you were a full-grown adult, you couldn't fit your hands in those machines. So this is how a lot of them used child labor. They had children who would put their hands in between the machines in the areas that an adult could not fit into, and there was a lot of issues. So imagine if going to work was not, going to school was not mandatory. It was just mandatory that you worked and went and worked in a factory. And this is why we say education is so important. It hasn't always been this way, and it's not this way in every country. In some countries, it's not mandatory for a child to go to school. You can go straight to a factory and go straight to work in some parts of the world. And it was like that here in America. These are just some images of what you would see. And remember, just to put things in perspective, if you were wealthy or affluent, it wasn't your children who were going to go work in these factories. It was always the children of the poor or the less well off who would be working in these factories. So keep that in mind. If you came from a family with means, you went to school. If you didn't come from a family with means, you had to find a way to provide and contribute.
Exactly. So we are moving on to the next paragraph. So we've been talking about people working and people fighting to get better conditions, safer, and they get more money. But another thing that started to become very big and important in this time with religion. So we're going to read. Around the turn of the next century, a religious movement called the Second Great Awakening helped shift attention to the social problems associated with urbanization and industrialization. So what we're seeing is people look at living in the city and they see some bad things. They see things they don't like. And in order to fix those things, they turn to religion, they turn to God. Because of low attendance at church services and declining religious convictions or religious beliefs, many religious faiths held revivals to re-emphasize people's dependence on God. During the Second Great Awakening, these revivals expanded across the nation, serving as an opportunity to hear the word of God. There were also social gatherings in which concerned citizens discussed faith-based solutions to problems in their communities. Charles Finney, a Presbyterian theologian, so a Presbyterian minister or a priest, and president of Oberlin College, organized many of the revivals. Finney encouraged women to participate and hoped his revivals would spark reform efforts across the country. Many problems associated with industrialization primarily affected the North, which was much more industrialized and urban than other regions of the country. So what that is saying is that a lot of the cities, a lot of the factories were in the North. So New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, those areas. And because of where the factories were, that's where urbanization and industrialization happen the most. You're not going to see industrialization happen in farming areas. You're not going to see it happen a lot in the South because they didn't have a lot of big cities or factories. So these problems are in a very specific part of the area, or a very specific part of the country.
Now, Mr. Josh, I want to pause you for a second because this is, I think, an opportunity to highlight a very important cultural difference between the North and the South. Remember, if you lived in the South, you lived rurally. You lived on some sort of agricultural related trade most of the time. If you lived in the North, you were dealing with working in the factory, for instance. So if I'm a white and I'm a poor white person living up north and my child works in a factory, I work in a factory, I'm not going to be as concerned with the institution of slavery going on in the South, right? As far as I'm concerned, I'm going through something that's also pretty challenging and pretty tough. So when we think about industrialization and the things that took place during this time, it's very important to take into account the experiences of individuals during that time, because though you had a certain group that was probably going through the worst situation possible in America, you still had other groups that were going through some pretty tough situations. And we've seen evidence of that throughout history.
Yeah. And just to wrap up this section, Americans from all walks of life, women and men, North and South, African American and white alike, got involved with social reform, the effort to improve social institutions to make things better for the people that were living there. These reformers wanted changes that would raise the quality of life for other members of society. And exactly, when we have these problems, they have these things that they're dealing with, people started to work together. They started to work in groups instead of just by themselves to push forward things, to make them better. So you saw out of this the unions, they were saying, well, we're paid enough. We are in unsafe jobs. We want better than this. We deserve better than this. So they fought for it. With religion, you saw kind of the same thing. They looked at the society, they looked at the cities, and they said, we can do better than this. People are not living, people are making bad choices. So we need to push back on that and make it better by having people come back to God. They get paid to move for their job. So unlike the jobs we were talking about last week with the Transcontinental Railroad, these jobs were, you just showed up. Most of the time you lived very close to them, so it was a short walk or able to walk to work, but they did not pay you to move to work in those jobs.
Right. And guys, it's a different time period, right? So, Mr. Josh, I could pick up and move to another state and find work. It was a very different time. You couldn't do that today, right? You have to apply. Hopefully somebody hits you back. But back then, there were so many of these jobs available compared to the population, at least in the beginning, that you can move to a new city and you can walk down the street and you can solicit your services and see, hey, are you hiring? Are you hiring? And you can get hired on the spot. So it was a very different time. You guys got to remember that as well.
Yeah, so as a result of the Great Awakening, mostly Christian groups asking people to come back to God, you saw a big increase in the amount of people going to church. You saw a big increase in the size of the denominations, because people thought that by going back to God, by being a part of the church again, things would get better for them, that there would be some result in that. So you definitely saw Christianity become bigger in the United States at this time. And that would continue on for decades as people continued to go to church at very high levels and continued to be very religious in that act. Good question. Pugh, that is our first section. And one is about slavery, and then we have rights for women after it. You want us to keep going?
Let's continue with challenging through, because we don't have as many days in this packet since the school year got shortened. So we'll continue through.
Yeah. All right. So we are on to challenging slavery. So this is going to be a little bit of a review, but let's go for it.
Hold on a second, Mr. Josh. Somebody has a question. All right, if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in, and after we're done reading, we'll get to it. We can't hear you. Whoops. Bad, technical difficulties. All right, Mr. Josh, sorry about that. A little technical issue there.
All good. And we are
All right,
back.
we can hear you
so
now.
I'm answered. Cool. And then we can move on. So the question that was asked right before I got kicked for a second, did other religious groups get bigger during this time? So back in the 1800s, back in the 1700s, there were two options for religion in the United States. You were either Christian, and that meant Catholic or Protestant, or weren't religious. So either that meant you didn't really believe in anything, you were an atheist, or you believed in things but you didn't do anything about it. You were kind of just there. At this time, there weren't many other beliefs in the United States among the white population and among the African population. There weren't many Muslims, there weren't many Jews. Some religions actually hadn't been created yet. So you had two options. And as immigration continued to grow, these new faiths come in. So as immigration keeps coming into New York City through Ellis Island, you see Judaism become a part of New York City. With immigration in the 1900s and the early 2000s, you see Islam become parts of communities where those people and those refugees settle down. But back then, back in the time that we're talking about, there really wasn't anything else but Christianity.
Right. So what we can say is that religion in America was essentially imported. It was brought. So as you had different groups that were bringing different religions and different beliefs from other parts of the world to America, you saw the expansion of those. So since the original groups in America were forms of Christianity, this is what you see in the Americas at this time. I thought that was a great explanation. All right. Mr. Josh? Ready for that section? Mr. Josh, you there? All right, y'all. This Instagram Live. It's getting janky. It's getting janky out here. We'll figure it out, though.
There we go.
All right. Yeah, it's a little better. All right, Mr. Josh, you ready? You want to read that?
Yeah. So the next section that we're going to talk about slavery. We've been talking about this for a while, so this should be a little bit of a review for y'all, but it is important to go over. So we are challenging slavery. Anti-slavery movements existed in the United States since the end of the 1700s. Still, the abolitionist movement, or the movement to end slavery, was different. These new abolitionists called for an end to slavery with the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people. Emancipation means letting people be free. So what they were asking for was basically just tomorrow you get to be free. You get to do what you want. You don't have to stay. These people, these abolitionists, also did not believe that the enslaved people's owners should be paid for the loss of their quote-unquote property. So this is really important because in a lot of states in the North that released slaves or ended slavery, they did so by basically buying the slaves off of those people that owned them. So instead of saying we're going to eliminate, we're going to defeat this idea, we're going to just pay you off. We're going to pay you, and then you don't buy any more slaves, and we're just going to move on. Abolitionists said, no, we're not even going to pay people for them because they don't deserve that. They don't deserve to be humiliated in that way. We are going to affirm, we are going to support that they are equal to us, and we are going to just assert, we are going to state that they should be free just because. So the new wave of abolitionists saw slavery as wrong on many different levels. Slavery was illegal because it went against the rights for all men in the Declaration of Independence. They also believed it was sinful for man to act above other people. They felt that slavery encouraged immoral behavior in owners of enslaved people. They also felt it destroyed the institutions of marriage and family. Enslaved children, wives, and husbands were bought and sold separately. So families were separated by the buying and selling of each person by themselves. Abolitionists asked for slavery to end, and they ran for government office so that they could make speeches and vote against it. They also wrote articles against slavery, and they were published in both the North and the South. So an important thing about this group, the abolitionists, is that they based it on faith. They based it on the idea that it was sinful, that it was against the beliefs and the support of God. And you see a lot of the people in the Second Great Awakening, that religious movement that we talked about, that increased the amount of Christians, those people who had just become Catholic or Protestant, really leaned into abolition. They used the Bible to say that slavery was bad. And yes, slavery is in the Bible, but it is a way of punishing the Israelites.
Great. So
And
important. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Josh.
yeah, and in that way, because the Israelites did something wrong, they were put into slavery. The argument that the abolitionists made is that Africans and African Americans had done nothing wrong. So there was no biblical reason, there was no reason from God for them to be put into slavery because they hadn't done anything.
Right. So important point here, right? You got one group who is working to justify the institution of slavery, right? We got one group that's looking to justify the institution of slavery using the Bible and Christianity. Then you have another group who's trying to say it's immoral, still using the Bible to justify their stance. So one of the things you guys have to understand about religion is, I wouldn't say religion is inherently bad or inherently good. That's a question that comes up. The idea is that how it's used, right, when it's weaponized, makes a big difference. You have two different groups of people who look at it from two different perspectives and treated these people completely different ways as a result of that. So that was an astute observation.
Good. So talked about that, and we're on to the last section, which is rights for women. So another question in chat. They couldn't do anything they want. So with slavery and with the abolitionists, as we know, when someone is in slavery, they are stuck where they are. They have for one person or a group of people, and they can't. But with the abolitionists, we have a group that's saying they should be able to do what they are able to do. They should be able to work for who they want to, travel, live their best life. And when you have the Bible, parts of the Bible say no. If you are a slave or an enslaved person, that is your life. Live with it. But then there are other parts of the Bible that say, no, you should fight against that. People are going to fight for you because God is against it, does not support what is going on. Exactly. Religion or belief can be a weapon. It can be support for sides. And as Mr. Pugh said, for both sides. If we remember watching the movie, one of the slave owners uses the Bible as a way to judge his bad treatment of the Africans that he owns. He uses parts of the Bible to justify them and keeping them enslaved because the Bible tells him to do that, or it tells him that that's okay. So there are parts of the Bible on both sides that support both things. It just depends on the context. It depends on the circumstance you are in.
Correct. The way in which people use it and interpret it. Interpretation is, I think, a key word in this scenario. All right. What we got next, Mr. Josh?
So we are on the last section for this grouping of ideas, which is the rights for women.
All right.
So, as we remember, women were not allowed to vote at this time, but they were starting to gain other rights. At the beginning of the 1800s, women had a great many duties at home and in the church. They were asked to do many things, but they had very little political or economic power. They could not vote. They had no access to colleges and universities. They could not hold any form of government office, and they had few professional opportunities for work. Married women were seen as dependent on and under the control of their husbands. They were unable to own property or make any sort of legal contracts, and in the case of separation or divorce, the father retained custody of the children. As the 1800s progressed, however, more women became empowered. As women joined the ranks of the social reformers, working for the benefit of others, they began to see the need for reform and equality for themselves as well. The fight for women's rights began mainly with the abolitionist movement. In the 1830s, many women were involved with the fight against slavery. More than 100 all-female anti-slavery organizations had been formed by the mid-1830s, and women were working hard behind the scenes to circulate petitions, edit anti-slavery articles, and help organize conventions. So what we're seeing at this time is when we have people fighting slavery against that oppression, women are also fighting against their own oppression. They couldn't really work out home. They didn't have a lot of rights. So now are they fighting for other people's benefit, for other people's rights? They also started to fight for their own. So you see a lot of groups, a lot of different people in this time starting to speak up, speak back against the way things are to improve the way that people live for a lot of different groups in the United States.
Right. So just keep in mind, once again, black men got the right to vote before women did. Okay. So women have always had rights that lag behind the general society. You've had several iterations of movements for women's rights throughout our history. So this is just one example. Yes, get married and be a housewife. That was literally the expectation of most women back then. So being single was not really a great option for a lot of women back then because you needed to have a man who could take care of you, and in some instances even be able to inherit whatever your family might be leaving behind. It was a very challenging time for women, right? So women were not slaves, but they didn't have many freedoms at that time, and that made a huge difference in what we were dealing with back then.
And a big part of the culture back then was when you guys, your parents were involved in that decision. They basically told you, we are going to be your husband or your wife because it benefits us as a family, or it can make us money, or it gets us power. So oftentimes you weren't even in control of who you dated and who you married. So women especially were told, this is what's going to happen, just going to have to accept it. So they were put in very bad positions because they had no power. And even when they did marry, even when they did have it wasn't always their choice. They were forced to do.
Correct. All right, Mr. Josh, let's move down to page, I believe it's page 7, Declaration of Sentiments. Let's move down to page 7, Declaration of Sentiments. Yeah, a lot of women were in bad relationships back then. It was not about love as we think of it today. It was more about survival, and it was more about a business decision than anything back then. So that's another good observation. It's absolutely the case. All right, Mr. Josh, you want to read Declaration of Sentiments? Oh no, he's gone. All right, Mr. Josh, can we you mind reading Declaration of Sentiments?
Okay, I'm back.
All right.
We got 5 minutes left, so we can start a little bit. So, there we go.
All right.
So, the Declaration of Sentiments. In 1848, an assembly of women who had been excluded from the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London 8 years earlier gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, modeling her declaration closely on the Declaration of Independence. So this is a document that was written by women stating what they believed and what they were fighting for. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, certain rights that you cannot take away, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, governments are created, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it, to refuse support for it, and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to see them most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So, that is hard reading. That is very old school English. And what it boils down to is that these women are stepping up. They are saying that men and women are equal. That is a very big deal in 1848 because that is not something that everyone believes in. Not only are men and women equal, but government doesn't support that. When the government doesn't allow that, women, or these women, are arguing that everyone needs to step up and fight for that because given by God, because it is inalienable. When any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, when the government pushes back, when the government fights you on it, it is the right of those who suffer to refuse allegiance. So if the government does not support me, it is my right and my duty to not support the government, back against it to make it change. It's time, that's a very radical statement. You're saying, I'm going to go up against the government, and a lot of people are scared of that because it's not something that people had said before.
Correct. So we'll pick up with this next class and break this down a little more.
Old time girl power.
Oh yeah, girl power. Exactly. There's actually an interesting series on Hulu right now, if you guys have it, called Miss America. That it's fictional, but it actually depicts some of the different arguments that took place later on in the 60s and 70s, while women were still fighting for certain rights and things like that. I've been watching it. I don't know if you heard of it, Mr. Josh. It's pretty good. Drop any questions or thoughts you guys have in the chat. We will pick up with this section on Tuesday, and we will have a more robust discussion about it because we can't leave the women out, right? Mr. Josh, anything in closing?
Good questions today. Good comments. People are really stepping up. It's nice to see. Hope y'all aren't getting tired of my voice, but we're gonna make technical difficulties. You got to change things up sometimes.
Yeah, we only got like 6 classes left, so yeah, we got like 6 classes.
Yeah.
All right, guys, you guys have a good one. Talk to you later.
See y'all later.